حضورنا الكريم مساء الخير وأهلا وسهلا بكم في أول أمسية ثقافية للمركز الثقافي العراقي في العام الجديد، وكل عام وأنتم بخير. I would say it in English. Welcome and to the Iraqi Cultural Center, the first cultural evening for the new year, and Happy New Year to you. هذا اليوم راح ناخذكم إلى موضوع مختلف عن الكاتبة البوليسية Agatha Cristie, and who is best and better than Agatha Cristie to warm up the cold evenings of the winter with her brilliant mind and brilliant plots. Our guest is Dr. John Curran. He is Agatha Christie's archivist and expert, مؤرشف أعمال Agatha Cristie. وتمتد علاقته بها إلى الطفولة. I will try to read in Arabic and English. I will alternate between the two languages. And يعود انشغال الدكتور جون كوران بأدب أغاثا كريستي إلى الطفولة. ففي سن 12 وقعت في يده روايتها Pearl at End House، ووجد نفسه مشدودا إلى أسلوبها، وراح يقرأ كل ما تواجد في المكتبة العامة The Local Library من رواياتها. في أوائل حياته عمل في تحرير الصحيفة الرسمية المكرسة لأدبها. He was the editor of the official Agatha Cristie newsletter. Also the National Trust, الهيئة الوطنية البريطانية المختصة بصيانة المباني التاريخية والحدائق، استعانت بخبرات الدكتور جون كوران في صيانة وترميم المنزل القديم الذي كانت تقيم فيه، واسمه جرينواي هاوس في مقاطعة ديفن. كما عمل الدكتور كارن في مساعدة حفيد أغاثا كريستي وهو ماثيو بريتشارد في in organizing her archive. من حوالي 2004 I think it was a happy event for Dr. Curran to find out that there was some literature of Agatha Cristie which hasn't been examined. عثر على 73 دفتر مسودات، أو إحنا بالعربي نقول مسودة، ملاحظات، drafts, notebooks, secret notebooks. وكانت تتضمن the way she sketches out the plot for her novels, and the way he puts it, I felt like a child in a sweet shop when you find something, a wealth of knowledge about the writer. So الدكتور كارن لم يتوانى عن مفاتحة الناشر الذي كان يطبع أعمالها من حوالي 80 سنة for 8 years، the HarperCollins، في حول هذه الثروة الأدبية التي عثر عليها The Secret Notebooks. فأصدر إلى حد الآن مجلدين بعنوان الأول Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks، والمجلد الثاني بعنوان Murder in the Making. وهذه المجلدات تترجم حاليا إلى 17 لغة عالمية، وتغطي 60 عاما من مسيرتها الأدبية ابتداء من العشرينيات. أيضا تناول في هذين المجلدين نشوء وتطور الرواية البوليسية الديتكتيف نوفل، وتعتبر طبعا أغاثا كريستي هي the crime queen as they call her. ولا يعتقد الدكتور جون كوران من خلال نقاش سابق أن هناك she is unmatched nowadays by any other writer who is the crime novels getting more complicated and violent, I suppose, which is completely different. الدكتور كاران يرى أن من أسرار شعبية ومقروئية أغاثا كريستي التي لا تفتر عبر السنين هي سهولة القراءة والحبكة المحكمة واللغة المبسطة، وكذلك شيء مهم وهو احترام القارئ، بمعنى عدم التطويل الزائد أو الممل. يعني رواياتها كانت تقع في حوالي 200 صفحة، وهذا الشيء مختلف عن 500 to 600 pages what we see nowadays with most novels. طبعا دفاتر المسودات أو المسودات هي مع أي كاتب كبير تعتبر نوافذ خاصة إلى عقله وإلى العملية الإبداعية التي الخاصة به. في حالة أغاثا كريستي هي نافذة إلى غرفة الإجرام السرية التي كانت تحبك فيها مخططاتها الروائية. في حياة هذه المرأة الإنجليزية الأرستقراطية القوية أو تبدو قوية لحظات رقيقة وظروف غامضة تكشف عن ضعفها الإنساني. ما يلفت انتباهنا هنا في المركز الثقافي العراقي أنها تعرفت إلى زوجها الثاني الذي دامت يعني الزواج إلى الوفاة، وهو ماكس مالوين في العراق في مدينة أور. She met her second husband. He is an archaeologist. And they went to sightseeing tours to many Iraqi cities and even to Kerbalah and Nejef. And also to the north, to Nineveh. There's a mysterious story in her life which was written about a lot at the time when she disappeared suddenly, days after when her the first husband asked for divorce. And then she suddenly turned up in a hotel under the name of the other woman, the lover of her husband. I think Dr. Curran is going to elaborate on that. عن كل هذا وغيره يحدثنا الليلة ضيفنا الدكتور جون كارن، وهو طبعا مشغول بإعداد رسالة الدكتوراه عن أغاثا كريستي، وراح يوضح لنا أيضا ما هو يعني الجوهر هذه الأطروحة، يعني أي جانب what aspect of Agatha's يعني writing or novels he is tackling or studying. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome, a warm welcome to Dr. John Curran. Didn't I? Well, I'm not the guest. أنا وحيدة المقدادي الصحفية العراقية. أهلا وسهلا. I forgot to introduce myself.
All right, thank you, Wahida, and thank you for the welcome. Can everybody hear okay?
Yes.
Okay. Now I'm going to talk about Agatha Cristie under a few headings. I'm going to go briefly through her life and the main events of her life. I'm going to look briefly at her output, and then I'm going to concentrate on her foreign travel, and then how that foreign travel influenced her novels right throughout her life. So, Agatha the person. She was born on the 15th of September in Torquay, the youngest of 3 children. She had an older brother and an older sister, and her father was an American. She had an idyllically happy childhood. She never went to school, not that that made it necessarily idyllically happy, but she was educated at home, and she claims that she taught herself how to read. She had a wonderful social life as she grew older. And then, as we will see, she had various romances. And in Torquay, the family, we'll come to that later, the family did travel, but for the most part she grew up in Torquay, and she also lived in Torquay for a lot of the remainder of her life. In 1914 she married Archie Cristie. Now 1914 was the start of World War I, and she married Archie on Christmas Eve 1914. And he immediately went back to the World War because Archie was a pilot. Now, from photos that remain, Archie was a very dashing, attractive, good-looking man, and of course a pilot was a very, very exotic job. And it wasn't with the complete approval of Agatha's mother that she married Archie. So she married him and he went back to war. During the First World War, she first of all volunteered as a nurse in the hospital in Torquay, but she didn't like it and she changed to become a dispenser in the hospital in Torquay, which meant that she had to study dispensing, and her certificate of qualification is still amongst her papers. But for Agatha, the crime writer, this was an important step because it gave her a detailed knowledge of poisons. And she uses poison as a murder method in her books more than any other method, and probably more than any other writer. And she got all of that from her time in Torquay in 1915. And she tells the story in her autobiography of her boss at the time. And they all wore white coats. And in the pocket of his white coat, he kept a lump of curare, which is a deadly poison. And he told her that the reason he did that was because it gave him a feeling of power as well at night. But 50 years later, when she came to write one of her, obviously later books, she introduced a man who did just that. Now, it wasn't until her autobiography was published that people realised where she got the inspiration, but it just illustrates that lots of things in her life that are seemingly insignificant, she stored them away for future reference for her crime novels. Her only child, Rosalind, was born in 1919, and Rosalind died just in 2004. And after Agatha's own death, Rosalind looked after her mother's estate very, very fiercely, and was very reluctant to give people permission to make films or television or radio dramas. In 1922, and I'll come back to this later, Agatha, in the company of Archie and Archie's boss, travelled the world, literally around the world. It was called the Dominion Tour, and it went through Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Hawaii, back through America, and then eventually back to England. The downside was that she left Rosalind behind in the care of her sister for a year, or almost a year, which probably didn't improve relations between them. And then, as Wahida mentioned, in 1926 she disappeared for 10 days. Now, she disappeared in December the 4th, but earlier in that year, her mother, whom she adored, died, and then Archie, whom she also adored, asked for divorce because he'd met another woman. So these two hugely traumatic events, coupled with the fact that she had to sell the family home, caused what I consider a nervous breakdown. They didn't have the phrase nervous breakdown in 1926, but Agatha disappeared, and because at that stage she was a well-known writer, and because she wrote crime and mystery novels, the press made a big thing about it. Possibly if she had worked in an office or if she was a housewife, it wouldn't even be mentioned in the papers. But because she was who she was, it caused a great furore, and the police forces of 3 counties searched for her, as well as thousands of ordinary men and women. She turned up 10 days later in a hotel in Harrogate, and as Wahida said, she was registered under the name of Archie's girlfriend, for want of a better word. They divorced 2 years later, and in fairness to Archie and Teresa stayed together until Archie died 40 years later. So it wasn't as if he was a serial philanderer. So Agatha, in 1928, found herself with a daughter, with no money, and a divorced woman. So she, again in her autobiography, she says this is what made her realise she was now a professional writer, because up to that she was writing books more or less as a pastime and a hobby. But now she had to write, and later on in the talk I'll talk about what she did in 1928 and where she went and how it influenced her writing. In 1920, again as was mentioned earlier, she married Max Mallowan. Again, I'll talk about that in more detail. This is a photo taken in 1946, and as you can see, Max is 14 years younger than Agatha, and There were quite a few problems with it because not only was he 14 years younger, she was a divorced woman with a child, and he was a Catholic and she was Church of England. So there were quite a few problems with it, but I'll come back to that later. The book, I should have spoken about the illustration on the first slide. That was her first book, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, 1920. In 1943, her only grandchild, Rosalind's son, Matthew, was born. In 1950, she was made a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, which was quite an unusual accolade for someone who wrote crime fiction, because that's what she was famous for. Also in 1950, the book illustrated here, A Murder is Announced, was published, and it was her 50th book, which is not completely unknown, but it is relatively unusual for someone to write 50 books, and 50 hugely popular and bestsellers. So June 1950, there was a big party in London to celebrate Agatha Christie's 50th book, and nobody knew at that stage that she would continue writing for another 25 years. In 1956, she was awarded CBE, Commander of the British Empire. Again, an unusual accolade for someone who just wrote crime fiction. In 1960, she was officially declared the most translated writer in the world. Something that still applies with the possible exception of Harry Potter. But Agatha, up to then, was certainly the most translated writer and the best-selling writer.
She sold a billion copies?
Well, she sold, the Guinness Book of Records has claimed for years that she has sold 4 billion copies. But that should be updated every year because she's still in print in every country in the world and in every bookshop and library in the world, and she's constantly reprinted. So that 4 billion has gone out of date, I consider, a long, long time ago.
So it's much more.
It's much more. And it is also very unusual for a writer of popular fiction to continue to be a bestseller 40 years after their death. And normally when there are no new titles from a popular writer, their popularity diminishes. But not so with Agatha Christie. Arguably, she's more popular now than she ever was before. In 1961, another unusual accolade for a crime writer, she was given a doctorate from Exeter University. And Exeter University has the archive of Agatha Christie's papers from her agent, which you can visit. In 1962, she was officially declared the world's best-selling writer. In 1968, she was made Agatha Christie Limited because it's hard for us to understand this, but throughout most of her life, she had little or no money. She had money in theory, but because I think she paid up to 90% tax on her earnings, quite often, and I have seen letters, she would write to her agent saying, I'm going abroad next week, how much can I afford to spend? Which sounds amazing when you consider she was selling millions of copies of books. But she in company with quite a few other well-known writers, were in litigation for years and years with both the UK and the US tax authorities. And while that was happening, she wasn't getting what was due to her. So a way around this was to create Agatha Christie Limited, and she was then given a salary as distinct from her royalties. In 1971, she was created a Dame of the British Empire. And I have it on good authority that she had been offered one earlier, but she refused until her husband was made Sir Max, which is a nice touch. In 1972, bigger than all of that, her works were printed into Madame Tussauds. And the last time I was there, she was there sitting next to Alfred Hitchcock. In 1973, she writes her last novel, Posture and Fate. And on this day, in 1976, the 1st of January, she died. Now, there was a gap of, as you can see, almost 3 years between her last book and her death. And there is now a theory that for the last 3 years of her life, she was suffering from Alzheimer's, which 40-odd years ago was not as well known a condition as it is now. At first, I didn't tend to subscribe to this, but I contacted the people who did this research, and they had very, very strong evidence. And if anyone is familiar with her later books, they are much more deeper. And I would argue that her last book should never have been published because it doesn't do her any favours. But when we come to her output, I'll talk a bit more about what happens in between. So this is Agatha the writer. She wrote a 66 crime novel. Her first book was 1920, and from that until 1956, at least one Agatha Cristie title was published every year. Up to the mid-50s, 2 titles were published every year. And in the 30s, in 1934, she had 5 titles published. Now, titles alone are impressive enough, 5 titles in 1 year, but when you consider that almost every one of those went straight into the bestseller list and are still available in every country in the world, you realise that Agatha Cristie could do something that no other crime writer since or before was able to do. As well as the 66 crime novels, she wrote 150 short stories. In the early 20s and 30s, the magazine market in the UK and in the US was huge. And all of the newsstands and railway stations had hundreds of magazines with short stories. So this was a very, very lucrative market, and Agatha began writing for it in 1922. So although we're familiar with her stories because they've been gathered into collections of 10 or 12, they all, virtually every one of them, appeared in magazines, both in the US and in the UK, throughout the 20s and 30s. She tended to stop writing short stories in the mid-30s and just did a few from then on, but it was very lucrative. And again, I've seen her sales books in her papers, and in 1924 she was selling stories to Scandinavian magazines, and I'm pretty sure very, very few UK writers were doing that. So 150 short stories is a huge number of short stories. Again, I'll come back to those because some of them were influenced by her foreign travel. She wrote 15 stage plays. Now the play that most people are familiar with is The Mousetrap, which last month celebrated 60 years in the West End, making it older than most people in the country. But she also wrote 15 other plays, not all of them as well known. Some of them are virtually unknown, but they're an aspect of Agatha Cristie that even her most devoted fans sometimes are not aware of. And for my next book, I hope to write a book about her plays, because most of them are really, really excellent. She also wrote 6 romantic novels under another name. Now, I have down there romantic, but I think a better description is bittersweet, because they weren't crime novels, although people do die in them. She published them under the name Mary Westmacott, and the first one was published in 1930 and the last one in 1958. And she considered the Mary Westmacott novels her holiday from crime writing, because she didn't have to plot them all out in great detail. And she was also very pleased when the first book was accepted as Mary Westmacott, and nobody except her agent knew it was Agatha Cristie. So it wasn't accepted and published on the basis that this was an Agatha Cristie. And in fact, it wasn't until the 1940s that somebody, we're still not quite sure how, worked out that Agatha Cristie was Mary Westmacott. And she was very displeased because she felt that from then on, the Mary Westmacott novels would be seen and published and reviewed because they were actually Agatha Cristie novels. But they are very, very different to Agatha Cristie. They are also much more autobiographical than the Agatha Cristie crime novels. She wrote 2 volumes of autobiography. One, the main autobiography, called An Autobiography, was published the year after she died. She began writing it in 1950 and she finished it in 1965, so she wrote hundreds of pages. And the reason for the delay in publishing it was because it had to be edited fairly ruthlessly. And she said in the foreword to it that it wasn't going to be a book that started in 1890 and went to 1965. She was going to write down things as they came to her. So it's a sort of a rambling memoir, and despite the fact that it's 500 pages, you still really don't get the Agatha Cristie, the real person, the real Agatha Cristie behind the pages. The other volume is this one here, Come Tell Me How You Live, which I'll come back to again, because it's concerned solely with her life on the archaeological digs with Max Mallowan. She says there's nothing profound or earnest in Iraq and Syria. Again, she wrote it she started it before the war, she put it aside, and she finished it just as the war was ending. And of course, both her agent and her publisher were horrified because they felt that the time she spent writing that would be better spent writing a crime novel. But she persevered, and because she was Agatha Christie, they did publish it. But it's an absolutely charming book, and one I would recommend. She wrote 3 volumes of poetry. One of the very first books that she published was a book of poems, and then she had 2 more during her life. They're not very profound poems, and it's safe to say that if they weren't written by Agatha Christie, they probably wouldn't have been published at all. But she enjoyed writing poetry, and what she did frequently through her life was she would write a poem for her daughter's birthday, or for Matthew's birthday, which was a lovely idea. And then she did some miscellaneous, she contributed to collaborative novels, and she did some reviewing, and she wrote articles, again mainly in the 20s and 30s. So that's a brief overview of Agatha Christie, the writer, but again we'll look at that more closely when we look at the foreign travel. So here's just from 1895 to 1928, and this gives you an idea of where she travelled and how much she enjoyed travelling. Because the very first one is 1895, and this was in the company of her family. And this seemingly wasn't an unusual thing for well-to-do British families to do. They travelled around France, southwest France, Paris, Brittany, the Channel Islands, for 3 or 4 months in 1895, and this was her first exposure to the French language, and she was not impressed. In 1907, she went back to Paris again, this time as a young woman, 17, to study French and music. Because throughout her life, Agatha had a love of music. She studied piano in Paris, and she studied singing. She was a very, very competent pianist, and in fact at one stage there was a possibility that she would be a professional musician. But luckily for her fans, she was too nervous. So she had to abandon that in Paris in 1907, but she still played the piano. And one of my greatest treats when I first visited Greenway House was to play Agatha Christie's piano, because it's still there in the drawing room, and despite the fact that it hadn't been played for 25, 30, 35 years, it was still in very good condition. And in the piano stool was lots of music with Agatha Christie, or Agatha Miller, which was her name before she married Archie, in fountain pen on them, and it was of a very high standard. In 1910, she visited Egypt with her mother. This was the equivalent of her coming out into society, and going to Egypt again was not such an unusual thing to do, and it was a lot cheaper than having a London season. So she was there for a few months with her mother, and she had absolutely no interest in ancient Egypt or any of the artifacts, although of course in 1910 none of the great discoveries, the Howard Carter discoveries, had yet been made. Agatha spent most of her time dancing with young men and having romances. But again, we'll see later, she did write a novel about her experiences in Egypt in 1910. 1922 is the grand tour that I mentioned later. Archie worked as a businessman. It's a little obscure as to what he actually did, but in 1922 his boss approached him about the possibility of going on a world tour to promote the British Empire, the Empire Tour. And his boss, who rejoiced in the name of Major Belcher, came around to dinner with Agatha and Archie, and in the course of conversation he mentioned that it might be possible for Agatha to go. So it was possible, and the 3 of them set off around the world visiting the countries I mentioned earlier. And again, as we'll see shortly, Agatha introduced some of the experience that she had there into one of her novels in the 1920s. In 1928, after the divorce, she went to Tenerife with Rosalind, who was then 9, and her secretary, Carlo. And she worked on one of the books, The Mystery of the Blue Train. And in 1928, again later that year, she had decided she was going to the West Indies for a holiday. But a few days beforehand, she went to dinner with some friends, and one of the friends had just come back from Baghdad via the Orient Express. So Agatha went into Cook's travel agent and exchanged her West Indian tickets for a trip on the Orient Express. which we'll come back to again. And bear in mind, she was doing this on her own in 1928. This was the first time she had gone away completely on her own, which was quite a big adventure for a female to travel right across the continent in 1928. These are some more of her travels during 1930, and as you can see, Beirut, Baghdad figures quite largely, and this is part of the time that she met Max Mallowan. Again, I'll come back to that because they're closely associated with her books. And again, you can see in 1931, she came home by the Orient Express, and it's that journey that influenced the novel Murder on the Orient Express. And by 1933, she was Mrs. Max Mallowan, and Max was becoming quite an eminent archaeologist. And you can see here, he was working in Iraq in 1933, sponsored by the British Museum and the School of Archaeology in Iraq. Then he moved to Syria and Shagar Bazar and Tel Brak in those years. And then during the war, there was little or no travel, because the next travel for Agatha was 1948, and I'll come back to that as well. And then you can see Nimrod is where Max Mallowan did most of his work, and in fact wrote a book about it. But Agatha accompanied him every year between 1950 and 1957. And then shortly after they came back from Nimrod, she went to America because Max was giving a lecture tour. These are mainly holidays that she took. And bear in mind, in 1960, Agatha Cristie was 70. So these are some of the places that she visited. And again, some of these occur in her writing. You'll see there, 1962 is Bayreuth, because I mentioned earlier her love of music, and of course that's the Wagner Festival. She was a big fan of Wagner, and she went to Bayreuth, and in fact she brought Matthew with her, and now to this day Matthew has a great love of Wagner. And in 1970 she was 80, and she was still visiting countries abroad, Cyprus and Austria, and a last visit to Paris in 1971 when she was 81 and quite frail. Now, these are the novels that were influenced by her writing. And these are the first four, as you can see, was in the 1920s. Now, to put this in perspective, in the 1920s, the detective novel, as we got to know it, was a hugely popular genre. And of course, Sherlock Holmes Arthur Conan Doyle didn't die until 1930, and the last Sherlock Holmes story was 1927, and Sherlock Holmes was unimaginably popular. And there were other detectives, Father Brown, for instance, who's starting on BBC next week, dramatisations. But most of Agatha's contemporaries set their stories in the UK. Agatha was very exotic, as you can see. Murder on the Links is set completely in France. Man in the Brown Suit, which I'll come back to, is set mainly in South Africa, but a lot of it is on a boat, which echoes her 1922 Grand Tour. The Secret of Chimneys opens in 1925 in South Africa. The Mystery of the Blue Train is set on the French Riviera, and Murder on the Orient Express, 1934. Then we come to the three really well-known foreign setting novels. Murder in Mesopotamia, Death on the Nile, Appointed with Death, all written one after the other, 1936, 37, 38. And you have to remember that in those years, for the vast majority of her UK and US fans, visiting the Nile or Iraq or Petra was as unlikely then as it is that we would visit Mars. So these were unimaginably exotic places. Nowadays, and for the last 40, 50 years, people can visit these places quite easily, but not in those days. So this was, apart from a very clever murder mystery, this was a very exotic setting, and none of her contemporaries were doing this. Death Comes at the End, 1945, and you can see it was a real experiment, set in ancient Egypt in 2000 BC. She wrote this book as a result of a suggestion from a friend of Max Mallowan, Stephen Glanville, who was an Egyptologist, and he was a big fan of Agatha Christie's writing. And he suggested to her about setting a murder mystery in ancient Egypt, because as he said, and of course he was right, in ancient Egypt, humans loved and hated and were jealous and killed each other just as much. So Agatha undertook it and regretted it a few times because, as she said, and this was quite a perceptive observation, it was easy enough to find out about palaces and kings and queens, but it was much more difficult to find out about everyday life, like what did they eat, what did they sleep on, what time did they go to bed, did men and women eat together. So Stephen Glanville probably regretted suggesting it to her because she plagued him with questions, but it is a wonderfully clever experiment. And nowadays, for the last 15-20 years, there's been a huge vogue in crime stories set in times other than our own. But Agatha was a trailblazer by doing it in 2000 BC in ancient Egypt. 1951, they came to Baghdad. I'll come back to that again later. Destination unknown, Casablanca, a Caribbean mystery, set firmly in the Caribbean, but on a fictional island, even though she was familiar with it because Matthew and his wife had a home in the Caribbean and she had visited it. Passenger to Frankfurt, which she published when she was 80, is set largely in Germany and Bavaria. And her short stories. In 1923, The Adventure of the Egyptian Tomb. Now this was in and around the time of the Howard Carter discoveries, and Tutankhamun and Howard Carter were as popular as Coronation Street or Big Brother or one of those things. I mean, so Agatha cashed in on this and wrote a story set in Egypt, echoing more or less the so-called story of the curse of the tomb that Howard Carter and most of his team all died down through the years. While the Light Last is a relatively obscure story but set firmly in South Africa, as is another short story that hasn't been published yet, also set in South Africa. The next two titles are short story collections, but again you can see they have a wide spread of settings: Belgium and Austria, the Austrian Tyrol, the Italian Dolomites, and the labours of Hercules, France, Italy, Switzerland, Ireland and the UK. Now, this is one of my favourites, not surprisingly, because this is Hercule Poirot's only visit to Ireland, and he was not impressed, I'm afraid. He stayed at a very bad hotel, and the food was very poor, and there was no heating in his hotel room, so he was not impressed with Ireland. Agatha visited Ireland on a few occasions, including a tour of the great houses and gardens of Ireland, and I was delighted to come across a letter that she wrote back to Max Mallowan, extolling the virtues of a beautiful house in the south of Ireland, which you can still visit to this day. But that's the only time that Hercule Poirot visited Ireland. Snow Upon the Desert at the top there. This is a novel that has never been published, and she wrote this as a result of her time there with her mother during her coming out season. And she decided, when she decided she wanted to write, she decided to write a novel, and she decided to use her experiences of her time in Egypt. Now, it was never published, even though she approached some publishers, but they said no, she needed to work on it. But luckily she put it aside and changed to crime fiction. The Mystery of the Baghdad Chest I'm including because of the Baghdad connection, but actually it's set firmly in the UK, but the body is found in a big chest that originated in Baghdad, but other than that it doesn't have a Baghdad connection. Akhenaten, again, she wrote in 1937, but it wasn't published until 1973. It's a play about the king Akhenaten, who in 1375 in ancient Egypt tried to introduce a new form of religion, which didn't work badly. And she tried again. She wrote it because she was fascinated by him and by the era, but it was never staged and it was never published until just a few years before her death. Come Tell Me How You Live is the book I spoke about earlier, and we'll come back to that. And then Nimrod and Its Remains is Max Mallowan's book, published in 1963 in 2 volumes, which is all about his archaeological work and his archaeological discoveries. So, France in Agatha Christie. As you can see, as we mentioned earlier, these 2 books date from the 1920s, when she would have spent quite an amount of time in France. Now, the first one, the Merge on the Links, Hercule Poirot gets a call from somebody, gets a letter from somebody in France to say, I think I'm in danger, can you come and investigate? And by the time he gets there, the man is dead. Now, while it is fascinating and it is set firmly in France, the big mystery for me and for lots of Christie people is why it's set in France, because there is nothing intrinsically French about it. It could just as easily be set in London or Devon or wherever. But the mystery of the Blue Train is set very firmly in the French Riviera, when the body, as you can see there on the cover of the first edition, is found in the famous Blue Train. So it exudes France from beginning to end, and Hercule Poirot is on the Blue Train, and he has a sort of a semi-romance with one of the other suspects on the train. And you may have seen the television version, which they did about 5 years ago. So that's Agatha Christie's influence, French influence, in those two books. South Africa, The Man in the Brown Suit and The Secret of Chimneys. The world tour, the Empire Tour, had taken place in 1922, and this book, she began writing it on the ship. Now, the two books that I've written are about her notebooks and the notes for virtually all of her novels, but The Man in the Brown Suit is one for which there are no notes, and I suspect it's because they were on the boat and she never brought them home with her, or they fell overboard or whatever. But there are no notes for The Man in the Brown Suit, but it is set, a lot of it is set on a boat as Agatha would have experienced, and then it's set in South Africa. And in fact, there was a minor revolution in South Africa while she was there, and she works that into the story. In many ways, it's not a typical Agatha Christie story because it's a thriller rather than a whodunit. And again, there's an appallingly bad television version of it, which I don't recommend. Iraq and Jordan. Murder in Mesopotamia was the first of the 3 foreign language novels. And this, of the 3, this is the one that most closely resembles her own personal experiences. Excuse me. And there are quite detailed notes remaining for it, thank goodness. It is set on an archaeological dig in Hassanaya, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. There actually is a little diagram in the book, and you have the courtyard of the dig, and then the rooms around the dig, and the gate into the dig. So that echoes exactly Agatha's experiences on a dig. But even more interestingly than that, she brings in some people. She doesn't name them, but it's pretty well accepted that some of the people who figure in the book actually figured in real life, including Max Mallowan. He's one of the minor characters, David Emmett, in the book. He's a suspect. There's also a priest in the book, and one of the first digs that she went to there was a priest, an epigraphist, and he appears in the book, disguised, of course. But the most interesting one is, in Murder in Mesopotamia, is the victim. In the book she's called Louise Leidner, but she's actually based on Leonard Woolley's wife, Catherine Woolley. And when Agatha first went out in 1928, she went with a letter of introduction to Ur, where Leonard Woolley was working, and his wife Catherine was with him. And Catherine, it seems, was a woman very, very difficult to get on with. She created a lot of dissension, and she demanded a lot of attention. And for some reason, Agatha Christie and herself got on very well. Agatha thinks it's because by the time she got there, Catherine Woolley had read some of her books and was very impressed that a woman was writing books that were wildly popular and sold in their hundreds of thousands and were available all over the world. So she was very impressed with Agatha, and the two of them took to each other. But from the point of view of Murder in Mesopotamia, the victim in Murder in Mesopotamia is a woman who is very difficult to get on with. She's the wife of the leader of the excavation, and she causes a lot of dissension, causes men to fall in love with her, and just keeps them dangling. And it is generally accepted that Catherine Woolley was the model for Louise Leidner. Now, whether Catherine Woolley ever knew this or not is debatable, because if she did, she would not have been impressed, because Louise is not a particularly nice woman, and in fact she ends up being the murder victim. So Murder in Mesopotamia is the one that the most closely resembles all of her experiences, and it wouldn't work. The plot of the book wouldn't work except under those conditions, unlike the one I was talking about a few moments ago, the Murder on the Links. That one, Murder in Mesopotamia, set at a dig, has to be set at a dig. And again, of course, that would have been completely unknown territory to most of her readers. Appointment with Death is set it opens in Jerusalem, and then it moves to Petra, the rose-red city twice as old as time, again which Agatha had visited. A fascinating city. And the family around which this story is set, the Boyntons, Agatha had met when she did a trip down the Nile. And in her notebooks she has a sketch of these people and what they were like. But she didn't use them in Death on the Nile. She transferred them over to Appointment with Death. But they are recognisable. The victim in this, again, is a woman who dominates her 5 children and is well on the way to ruining the lives of all of them, and she's found dead in Petra, and Hercule Poirot has only 24 hours to solve the mystery. So again, that's a book that closely echoes Agatha's own experiences. Egypt, I mentioned Snow Upon the Desert earlier. That's the one that hasn't been published and possibly never will be, and The Adventure of the Egyptian Tomb. Death on the Nile is one of her most famous books, probably because of the well-known film. This is also one of her longest books, and there on the left you see the first edition. The artwork for the first edition, as for the previous two, you can see the similarity. They were all 3 of them were designed by somebody from the dig, Robin McCartney. He was an architect, and again he was an Agatha Cristie fan, and when he offered to design the covers, Agatha Cristie said yes, and as you can see they are very, very evocative and leave you in no doubt as to where the book is set. Death on the Nile is set on the Nile, both in the hotel along the Nile and in the steamer. Now I assume most of you, if you haven't read the book, will have seen some of the adaptations of it. David Suchet did a very good adaptation a few years ago, but prior to that there was a very exotic version with an all-star cast done much earlier than that. Both of them sticking very closely to Agatha's story. And Agatha herself felt, she wrote about the book later and said that the central situation of the Eternal Triangle aboard this steamer, she felt had great dramatic possibilities. And she adapted it as a play some years later, although it wasn't very well received by the critics. Murder on the Orient Express. Now, as we've seen earlier, Agatha had 2 experiences on the Orient Express in 1928 and in 1931. The dedication on Murder on the Orient Express is to M.E.L.M., which is Max Edgar Lucian Mallowan. But at the time, very few would have known that. And as you can see, that was where he was working in 1933. I'm not going to try pronouncing it, but that would be the first dig that they went to as a couple. Again, it's based on her own experience, because on her way back on one of the journeys on the Orient Express, it got stuck. Now, I presume most of you know the story of the Orient Express. It starts in Istanbul. Hercule Poirot gets on the train, and it's, oddly enough, it's very full. They manage to get him a berth, and a day later the train gets stuck in a snowdrift, and one of the passengers is found stabbed in his berth, and the only people who could possibly have done it are the people in the carriage. So Hercule Poirot has to find out who done it before they get to the next stop, because then the police will move in and investigate. And because it's midway between countries, there would be a lot of legal problems, so Hercule Poirot has to solve it. So the story goes between Istanbul and Yugoslavia, and we leave the train then when the story is solved and they clear the snowdrift. But actually there was a famous snowdrift for the Orient Express in 1931, and when Agatha travelled it, there was not a snowdrift but a rain drift, or whatever the phrase would be, and she was stuck for 2 days. When she got back to London, she immediately sat down and wrote a very, very long letter to her husband, explaining what had happened and describing the people, her fellow passengers. And it is possible, when reading that letter, to identify some of those people that she subsequently put into the book. For instance, there's an American woman who talks a lot about her daughter, who is wonderful, and Mrs. Hubbard on the train talks a lot about her daughter, who is wonderful. It probably has her greatest cast of foreign suspects. As you can see there are English, American, Italian, Swedish, German, French, Hungarian and Russian suspects on the train. Because, can I give away the solution? Can I spoil it? The solution is, and it is still, well, it was at the time a unique solution, and it is still pretty unique, because it transpires that everybody on the train took one stab at the victim, so they're all guilty. But the story began some years earlier in America, when a child is kidnapped, the ransom is paid, but the kidnapper still kills the child, which was an appalling crime. And it's based loosely on the Lindbergh kidnapping, where the famous flyer Lindbergh's child was kidnapped. They paid the ransom, and the child was found dead a few days later. So Agatha took that as the basis for her plot. But the reason for the huge cast of foreign suspects is because they're the people who were working in the house where the child was killed. It was a very wealthy family, so they had cooks and butlers and chauffeurs from all these countries in Europe. Now, I always maintain there should be an Irish person in there, because thousands of Irish people emigrated to America in the 30s, including some of my own family, and worked for wealthy families as cooks and as maids. Anyway, it's also one of Poirot's very, very few failures, because Poirot had a very great opinion of his own abilities, and rightly so, and he claimed never to fail. But in the closing chapters of Murder on the Orient Express, he lets them know that he knows the solution, but because he considers that their motivation was justified, he agrees to fail. In other words, when the police do arrive, he tells them that it was somebody who escaped from the train, and he's not able to identify them, so the suspects actually get away with murder. Now, morally, that's questionable. And in fact, if you saw the second TV adaptation, they take the moral dimension very much to heart and discuss it, to my mind, to the detriment of the story. But because the motive was what it was, the killing of a child, in 1934, Agatha considered that was acceptable. And of course, because the solution to the story was so unique and such a surprise, I think she gets away with it. But then I would say that. Now, this is Max Mallowan's book, Nimrod and Its Remains, and it's published in 2 volumes, but it's concerned strictly with things archaeological. He was a very eminent archaeologist, and he worked in Oxford, and he worked a lot for the British Museum. And this is the result of his life's work, basically. If you want to find out more about Max Mallowan, the one on the left, Mallowan's memoirs, is, not surprisingly, his own memoirs of his life. And there are 4 chapters in the centre of that about his life with Agatha. And for Agatha fans, the really interesting chapter amongst those 4 is a chapter of her fan mail. Because she got fan mail from all over the world, including from a certain John Curran in Dublin, throughout her life. And she was very good at replying to fan mail. And she signed one and sent it back to me, and she did the same for thousands of others. And some of her fan mail is still preserved, but Max Mallowan talks a lot about her fan mail. The book on the right is The Life of Max Malawian by Henrietta McCall, who also knew both Agatha and Max from their work personally. And she wrote this sort of joint biography, but it's mainly about Max Mallowan. The autobiography, Agatha's autobiography, as I mentioned earlier, she worked on between 1950 and 1965, was published in 1977. Now, the edition there is not the 1977 edition, but an edition that was published the year before last. And in it, in the back of the book, there's a CD of Agatha Christie's voice. Throughout her life, Agatha Christie would never do something like this. She never did signing sessions, she never did interviews. She flatly refused to appear on radio or television. And I've seen letters from all over the world, from media companies, asking they will agree to any conditions she wants to set down if she would agree to be interviewed, and the answer was always no. So a few years ago, her grandson Matthew found a very old tape recorder and very old tapes, little, very, very small tapes. The technology is years out of date, but he managed to find somebody who was able to convert them. And to everyone's surprise, they were Agatha talking her autobiography into this tape recorder, dictaphone. 2 points about that. The autobiography, as I said, the edited version is over 500 pages. The unedited version had 2 or 3 extra hundred. And the reason for that is because she was speaking it. She wasn't actually typing it. So, of course, it was much easier to keep talking. But because she never gave interviews, there are very, very, very few examples of, certainly of Agatha Cristie on film, but also very few examples of Agatha Cristie on the sound of Agatha Christie's voice. So this was a really, really unique discovery. So Matthew agreed when her autobiography was reissued, to put a CD in the back with very, very short extracts, but they amount to about an hour of Agatha Cristie talking. And for the most part, the extracts are Agatha talking about her writing, which of course for Agatha Cristie fans is what they want to hear about. Because even in her autobiography, she writes very little about writing her books. So for anyone who has read the book and haven't heard the CD, I would strongly recommend it. The Grand Tour, the book on the right, was published last year, and it's edited by Matthew. And Agatha, with great foresight in 1922, kept hundreds of photographs. She was a great photographer. She kept lots of photographs. She kept things like menus from the hotels she visited, postcards from the hotels, obviously photographs of all the places that they stopped off in. And they were all preserved at home. So Matthew went through them and picked out the really interesting ones and included them in this book, and also Agatha's account of that 1922 trip around the world. So it's a very, as they say, lavishly illustrated book. And for anyone interested either in Agatha Cristie or in what it was like to travel around the world in those days, when travel was in many ways more elegant, but took a lot longer than it would nowadays. It's a fascinating glimpse into an era that we'll never see again. And these are 2 books by some chap called John Curran. They're strictly about her notebooks, because Matthew gave me access to her notebooks. As I said earlier, in her own book she talks very little about her writing, much to the frustration of her fans. So when I was given access to her notebooks, I knew that fans wanted to know, where did she get the idea for Murder on the Orient Express? How did she change her mind? How did she decide who was going to be the murderer? How did she decide which book would be a Poirot, which book would be a Miss Marple? So when I got the notebooks, all 73 of them, or initially I read them just for my own entertainment because I was fascinated. But then when I approached Matthew with the suggestion of a book, he immediately said yes, and as did HarperCollins, because HarperCollins published Agatha Cristie from 1926. In fact, they publish her to this day. So they were the obvious people, and they were very happy to publish the book as well. And I was also given the great honour of including some unpublished short stories in each of them. And luckily I was able to find notes about her writing of those short stories, which made it all that much more interesting. So we're back to where we started. And I would just, before I finish, if you look at the top left-hand corner of that photograph, you will see her signature. Can you see it? And that photograph was taken in 1948 because, again, she hated having her photograph taken, even for book jackets. And anyone who's familiar with the earlier editions of her books, or even the current ones, there are no photographs of Agatha Cristie, because she was very self-conscious about the fact that she was quite overweight throughout her life, because she loved her food. And so that was the official photograph for a long time. So I hope that answered a few questions about Agatha Cristie, but I'm very happy to answer any type of question about anything to do with her life, if I wasn't clear. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the gentleman.
Can you talk about where she wrote, how she wrote?
Yeah. Well, I'm saying yes very confidently, but actually that's a bit of a mystery, because I've spoken to some people, including Matthew, who knew her well, and they all say they never saw her actually writing. Now, in her autobiography, she said all she needed was a typewriter and a table. And that seems to be the truth. When she was abroad, because she spent at least 3 months of every year on the dig with Max Mallowan, she bought a table. Now, she says it cost £10 in her autobiography. He said it cost £5. But she bought a table and she would disappear for a few hours every day and do her writing and then put it away, and she never talked about it, or she never mentioned it, she never discussed it. The same when she was at home. She would disappear for a few hours, do her writing, and then go on with her life. Because when you read her autobiography, what amazes you is when you consider that she published 80 titles, which is a huge number of titles, but she also had a very, very full life, including all of her foreign travel, as we've seen, including the 3 to 4 months that she spent every year for 20 odd years with Max Mallowan on the digs. She travelled extensively elsewhere. She loved theatre, and she loved music, and she loved concerts, and she loved entertaining. So when she actually did all this writing, it's still a bit of a mystery. The theory is, and it is only a theory, that for when she became well known and when she became very prolific, i.e. in the mid-30s, that she used one of these dictaphones that I mentioned, and she would dictate the book. It would go out to a typist, a professional typist, who would send it back, and then she would do handwritten amendments. But believe it or not, and it is difficult to believe, HarperCollins or her American publishers kept no manuscripts. There is only, to my knowledge, one manuscript, and luckily it's in the archive, heavily annotated and changed. But other than that, the habit was with any writer, when the book is published, they would contact the writer and say, do you want your manuscript back? Sometimes the writer would say yes, but if they said no, HarperCollins just destroyed it. And I suppose you can understand that they couldn't keep thousands of manuscripts. They've been publishing since the 1900s. But unfortunately, I would have thought, as Agatha Cristie became not just famous, but an iconic figure, somebody would have had the foresight to keep her manuscripts, but they didn't. So we don't actually know how much work she had to do, but it seems that she, as I say, from about the mid-30s on, she dictated the books. There are some tapes existing with some of her later books. I haven't listened to all of those yet. I have listened to one, and there are some significant differences between the taped version and the published version, which I hope to talk about in a later book. But to answer your question briefly, nobody really knows, but she seems to have been very, very disciplined, and she knew exactly what she wanted to do, and she just went off for a few hours every day and did it, and then went back to her real life, if you like. So,
Did she have an editor?
She did have an editor, but my own feeling on that is that as she became better known and more famous, who was going to ring up Agatha Cristie and say, Agatha, I don't think this is really working, can you change the ending of it? Because at that stage, she still is one of HarperCollins' most lucrative writers. I mean, she's still in print, and they've been publishing her for the last 80 years. So I think as she became better known, there was very little editing done on it. There are some letters in the archive in Exeter University, but they're mainly from the reader who would first read the manuscript when it arrived in HarperCollins, and they would say, amazing though it is now, they would say, yes, I think we can publish this and offer a 3-book contract. I think we would probably sell 50,000 copies, as if that was an everyday occurrence. But sometimes they're not quite as complimentary, and in fact, for They Came to Baghdad, which is a thriller as distinct from a detective story, the official reader, HarperCollins, says, I think Mrs. Cristie must be joking. But then he goes on to say, however, it is as readable as ever, and I think will sell in its thousands. So, but I feel that as she got really elderly, as into the 70s, the editor should have done a better job, because the last few books are very, very poor. They shouldn't have been published. But at that stage, Agatha Christie's shopping lists would have been published and bought by hundreds of thousands.
Sorry, could you shed some light on her romantic novels? You said that she wrote six romantic novels.
Yes.
What are the similarities and differences in romantic novel and detective ones?
Right, well, as I said earlier, the romantic novels, she began in 1930 and the last one was 1958. She published them under a pseudonym so that nobody for a long time knew there was any connection with Agatha Christie. They're mainly about romances that aren't romantic, that don't work out, unhappy romances. One of them, for instance, is about a woman who goes to the desert and is trapped by bad weather, and she spends the weekend thinking about a romance that she has back at home, and she sort of has a whole revisioning of her life as it stands, and she decides she's going to do something different, but actually when she goes back she doesn't. The most interesting of the books is one called A Daughter's a Daughter. Now, maybe some of you may have seen it because it was done as a play a few years ago in London. And I think, although we're not sure, that it was a play to begin with and she turned it into a novel. But it's quite an amazing book because it's about a mother-daughter relationship. And I was at the first night of the play with Matthew. And as the play, I had read the book, of course, and I'd actually read the script of the play. And I was a little uncomfortable because the two women on stage, the mother and the daughter, who spend most of the time arguing and fighting and saying terrible things to and about each other. Matthew said at the first interval, "That's my mother and my grandmother." And in the play, the mother meets a younger man. She's been divorced from her first husband. She wants to marry the younger man, and the daughter is not impressed. Now, you can see the similarities immediately. And I didn't want to say anything until Matthew said it. So Matthew said it, so that was okay then, it was accepted. So that is the most autobiographical of the novels, and you can see why she would want that published under a pseudonym. But the first book concerns a composer, and Agatha, as I mentioned, has a huge love of music, and in fact, in that piano stool in Greenway House is a waltz that she published during the 20s. I mean, she was that competent a musician that she wrote a waltz for piano and it was published. So the book Giant's Bread is about a composer who was publishing avant-garde music in the 1930s and the struggle that he had. So the books are quite autobiographical, but at the same time, as with any writer, you have to be careful about not assuming everything in the book is autobiographical. The main structure may be autobiographical, but not necessarily everything. But you read them knowing that they're not a detective novel, or there's no surprise in the last chapter, or there's no detective. And if you read them as that, they are interesting, very interesting.
How do you explain the fact that she used the false name for her romantic novels?
Because she wanted them accepted by the publisher, which wasn't HarperCollins. She wanted them accepted not knowing that they were anything to do with Agatha Christie, so that they just got this manuscript by somebody they'd never heard of before and decided to publish it on its merits, as distinct from saying, oh, well, as they do now, that, as a test for herself, because now you can get them now, but if you look at the cover, it will say, A Daughter's a Daughter by Agatha Cristie, writing as Mary Westmacott. And you can't blame publishers, they want to sell books. But that's what she wanted to avoid in 1930. She wanted it published on its own merits. Yes?
What writers influenced her? This is my first question. The second, what do you think induced her to go into this field of the detective literature?
Again, she talks briefly about that in her autobiography. The main inducement to write a detective story, believe it or not, was a bet from her sister. Her sister Madge, and in fact her mother, they had all written, and some of their writing is still in the archive of Agatha's papers. Madge actually had a play put on in the West End before Agatha did, but Agatha and Madge were discussing books one day, and for some reason Madge said to her, I bet you can't write a good detective story. At the time, as I mentioned, Sherlock Holmes was hugely popular. And the other books that influenced her, according to her own book, is two books which are mainly forgotten nowadays, except by people like myself. A book called The Mystery of the Yellow Room by a French writer who's now best known as the writer of The Phantom of the Opera. And a book by an American woman writer, Anna Catherine Green, called the Leavenworth Case. And the Leavenworth Case is very Agatha Cristie-ish. It's set in a country house. There are two beautiful women suspected of murdering the man in his study the day before he changes his will. So you can see the influence there immediately. So those factors combined with the bet induced her to write her first book. She used poison, which she had studied. She started writing the book in 1916 during the war. It was turned down by 5 publishers. She had quite a struggle with the 6th publisher to have it published. And she based Hercule Poirot on the refugees from Belgium who were staying in Turkey to escape World War I in Belgium. But I feel that even though the sister may have had the bet with her, she still had to have an innate ability and a gift to be able to write 80 books. But they were the immediate spurs that got her to write and to start detective fiction. And thank goodness she did. Yes, the lady there.
Can you tell us, have the books been translated into Arabic?
Oh, yes.
Can you talk something about her life in Iraq?
Well, first of all, the books in Arabic, yes, because many, many years ago, I bought an Agatha Cristie in Arabic. And of course, I had no idea. The only way I knew it was because that photo was on the cover. But when I went home, I sent it to the Department of Arabic in Dublin City University. And to my horror, they wrote back to say it wasn't an Agatha Cristie at all. Just a very clever publisher had put Agatha Christie's name on it. But no, she has been published in Arabic. Her work on the digs, the most amazing thing I think about her work with Max Mallowan and on the digs was, the fact that she worked. She didn't just go to sit around admiring everybody else working. She actually worked very hard. Her jobs were at various times, to photograph the finds, to catalogue the finds, and to clean the finds. And I was talking with Wahida earlier, and one of the things that she used to clean the finds was her face cream, as she says herself, her very expensive face cream. And in fact, the British Museum had an exhibition the year before last of some of these items cleaned by Agatha Christie's face cream. So she worked very hard, but the most amazing thing I think about the time that she spent on these digs is, first of all, that she spent 3 to 4 months. Now, if any of you have seen Greenway House, where she lived, or Winterbrook House, which was her other house, they're big houses in their own grounds. She had a butler, and she had a housekeeper, and she had a maid, and she had gardeners, and yet she went and lived in a tent in the desert. And when she went originally in 1930, it was very, very primitive, because she talks in the Come Tell Me How You Live book about the tent full of mice and spiders and scorpions and all sorts of awful things, and she was sleeping in a sleeping bag. But in the early days, I think this is quite entertaining, in the early days everybody dressed for dinner. And there's actually a photograph in the archive of everybody sitting around the table in their dicky bows and black jackets, and the ladies in their evening gowns, in the tent, in the desert, having dinner. But she obviously loved this life, because she went there for over 25 years until she was in her mid-60s. And yet, when she came back to the UK, although she worked hard, she lived a very comfortable life in beautiful homes with an indoor staff, and yet she went and did all this for 25 years, for 3 or 4 months of every year, and she absolutely loved it. In fact, when I finish, I'll read you a short quotation from this book to show exactly what I mean. So does that answer your question?
Good evening. I'm Harry. This is Patsy Easterly. We have very much enjoyed our evening here at the Iraqi Cultural Center with John Curran's talk about Agatha Cristie and her time in Mesopotamia. The welcome we've received here has been very warm and is, as I understand it, typical of Iraqi culture. Thank you so much for having us.
And also the extra treat of the delicious food. Wonderful. It was a great time there, and everyone's so friendly. And you feel quite at home.
We wish the Iraqi Cultural Center every success.
Yes, we do.
Thank you.
Hope to be back. Thank you.
Well, I was very happy with the evening because quite a lot of people asked questions from the audience, and then quite a lot more people came up to me afterwards and asked questions because they didn't like to put their hand up. So I was very happy, and I'm always pleased if, as a result of my talk, even two people go home and start reading Agatha Christie or start to reread Agatha Christie that they read many years ago.
هذا قطار الشرق السريع الأورينت اكسبرس ترين، بالحقيقة أنا سافرت به، لكن مو ويا أغاثا كريستي مع الأسف. سافرت مع امرأة عراقية من بغداد إلى اسطنبول، من اسطنبول إلى فيينا، وبعدين إلى لندن. يعني أنا سافرت بهذا القطار. والعجيب الآن طبعا الخط جيد وهذه، لكنه في زمانه كان في زمن العشرينات كان هذا الخط يتوقف عند مدينة بيجي، وعلى المسافر أن ينزل يركب سيارات أو يركب خيل أو شوف شنو عرباين حتى يوصل بغداد. فما أدري أغاثا كريستي كما روت كيف كملت السفرة من بيجي إلى بغداد. بس الأوروبيات عندهم المنحة هذه، الموهبة على الصبر وتحمل المصائب. احنا بالعراق لما تقول لي امرأة روح عيشي بالبدو بالصحراء في خيمة 40 يوم ما مستحيل تدبرها، لكن النساء الأوروبيات عندهم الصبر وقدرة التحمل.
Basically, one of the main reasons behind the Iraqi cultural centers is to enhance the relationship between the communities. So I think it is very important to bring if I can say, the English view to the Iraqi Cultural Center to strengthen the linkage between the two communities, the two cultures. And also, I mean, the Iraqi Cultural Center, or the cultural centers in general, is to encourage the dialogue between the populations instead of the language of violence. So, and also, I mean, it is very important to have someone to speak about Agatha Cristie. I mean, this big name who has a very strong link with Iraq in the Iraqi Cultural Center.
Tonight, the Agatha Cristie in the Middle East and Iraq was a very interesting evening. It wasn't what I expected at all. He covered everything about Agatha Christie's life and a little bit about how, or what she thought of Iraqi people and Syrian people. It was quite interesting.
طبعا المركز الثقافي يهيئ فد أمسيات بالحقيقة تدل على يعني عمل جبار ومتفاني في سبيل أن يلم الجالية العراقية around لندن. وإحنا يعني بالحقيقة سعداء جدا بهذا المكان اللي هي لنا فرص أنه نتعرف على يعني القدراء أو الفنانين أو المثقفين العراقيين والأجانب أيضا، ومن خلال طبعا اللقاءات اللي يعقدها المركز الثقافي. اليوم طبعا كانت المحاضرة على الكاتبة والروائية أغاثا كريستي اللي هي طبعا غنية عن التعريف. المركز طبعا هذا كان فد التفاتة رائعة من عنده أنه يعرفنا على هاي الروائية، لأنه احنا نعرف من كنا أطفال أغاثا كريستي هي يعني روائية قصص بوليسية وكذا، بس ما كنا نعرف بالحقيقة هذا الكم الهائل من المعلومات اللي وصل لنا إياها صديقها اللي استضاف المركز الثقافي. طبعا مشكور لأنه جهد رائع. تعرفنا على الكثير من المعلومات اللي وفر لنا إياها المتحدث اللي هو كان ملازم لها بحياتها، وكان أكو بالإضافة للمتحدث أكو مترجمة واللي ساعدت أيضا بتوصيل المعلومات للعراقيين اللي يحتاجون اللغة العربية. طبعا نشكر المركز الثقافي وكل القائمين عليه، والمدير الأستاذ الدكتور عبد الرحمن اللي في الحقيقة يقدم جهد هائل في سبيل أن يوصل تاريخ العراق وحضارة العراق وفن العراق كل شيء يعني يظهر العراق بالوجه اللي احنا نتمناه للأجنبي وللإنجليزي وللأوروبي ولكل الطوائف بكافة يعني دياناتها ومذاهبها. طبعا بالنهاية ما نريد نطول عليكم. إن شاء الله يكون هذا فد مكان للم العراقيين بكل طوائفهم وبكل انتماءاتهم، وإن شاء الله طبعا يوفقهم يتوفقون يعني وفي إيصال الرسالة اللي هم فتحوا بيبان هذا المركز لهم. فبالختام أشكر كل القائمين على هذا المركز، وإن شاء الله يعني ينجحون بعملهم هذا الجبار. شكرا جزيلا.
This has been a great event, hearing about Agatha Cristie and her tours to the Arabic countries, and especially in Iraq. Excellent.
You see, the topic is very good and appealing, always, and I think the evening went very smoothly and it was in harmony. I mean, everybody was feeling at home, even the guest speaker, and that's important. People feel attached, not detached from what's going on the stage, or, you know. I think it was very successful in its own way, because everything went very smoothly.